بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Yes, Assalamu alaikum everybody, and thank you for tuning in to what is an absolutely fascinating subject. So I, I suppose I've been presenting iterations of this for a while to our young people, and also going on a journey of discovery myself, of course, about this. I am a GP, so we are in the business of mental health and I suppose mental well-being as well. Yeah, not just mental ill health, but how to reverse the ill health as well. And being a dad of four um, children that are only one of them is now a teenager, mashallah, and the others are all sort of beyond that. And so have experienced firsthand, the difficulties that many young people go through. Also, of course, a mentor at ISB campus as well, and teach many of the people in campus, but also YM before that as well. So yeah, this subject has been presented, discussed, experienced, navigated over a number of years. So I started my journey into psychology, I suppose, really as a GP, of course, and then through NLP training, which is slightly offbeat, a little bit wacko, but it still brings in a little bit of psychological approaches into how to kind of navigate relationships and things. And so obviously CBT, dealing with therapeutic approaches to mental health in my own career. But then after that, I started doing deep dives into various subjects, and I was a few years ago going deep into history. And at that point, I thought it'd be really interesting to learn a little bit more about prehistory. What went on before everything that's been written down and known about human beings in recordable things that we can see of humans, things that were said about ourselves, and that brought me into direct contact with a book called Humankind. Just out of interest, it'd be interesting to know how many people have read that book. Has anyone heard of Humankind by Rutger Bregman? No. So, I mean, the next question was if you've read it. So I guess we'll skip that one. It really is a very, very interesting. I mean, Rutger Bregman is an atheist, and that's unfortunate. I'm sure if he had been exposed to Islam in his younger years, he wouldn't be an atheist now. But unfortunately, the problem is that for many Europeans, their perception of religion is Christianity, isn't it? And so if you're not impressed with Christianity, you basically chuck out the baby with the bathwater, sadly. So anyway, yeah, and that just opened up a whole world of awareness, and then started doing a lot more reading into psychology. So anyway, let's stop waffling and crack on. So I want to start, and this is like sort of recently, when about the self, I've connected it to, I mean, there's obviously when you talk about the self, you could go on for years. The whole of the Quran is really about the human being. It's about the self in a way, isn't it? And the discovery, and the self's discovery of God and discovery of our nature and how to deal with it. And you can do the seers of the Quran forever as well. So yeah, the subject is absolutely huge. And so there's only a small element of that I'm going to discuss today, which is our psychological needs or our fitri needs. Okay, and it's like a map essentially that I'll sort of go a little tour of. to talk about that more. But yeah, so nowadays what I tend to do is preface that with an understanding of us as human beings and our long story. So kind of going back to what Rutger Bregman did with humankind, essentially. And here, there's a couple of verses that are very interesting. The first verse is the one about when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to Adam and Hawa and says, descend, being to one another enemies. And for you on the earth is a place of settlement and enjoyment for a time. And that was, when you just think about that verse and you think about their life where they had everything, and now all of a sudden they are cast into this wilderness, which is essentially empty. Now, you could argue that there may have been some other hominid species around. We know that Neanderthal man has been around for 800,000 years, heck of a long time, and possibly other hominids before that as well. But essentially, it was a very, very empty, barren landscape. And there they were, being asked to make their own way in this world. And food won't come to them naturally. You've got to strive and struggle for shelter, for security, and for food. So that was must have been a very scary time for our ultimate ancestors. And then there's another verse which is really interesting as well. And this is in Surah Dahr or Insan, and two names for the surah. And that both of those names come from the first verse, which goes, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. That haven't eons of time passed by over mankind when he was not anything remembered or mentioned. Yeah. شيئا مذكورا. That he wasn't anything that you can see and remember. And we know that our prehistory is a mystery, essentially, right? Because there's nothing left. We haven't left any buildings from our prehistoric times. The only things that we do have are like cave paintings, but that's about it. And what's interesting is, let's have in the chat, any ideas how long human beings have been around? And everyone, don't be embarrassed. Just check it in. Oh, sorry. I've just noticed this. Not hearing very well. I wonder if there's something to do with. Let me just check the settings. One moment. Bear with me. Are other people having problems with hearing? Anyone else having problems with hearing? Oh, okay. Good. Okay, so it may have been the volume on your own PCs. Okay, yeah. So the question is, what's the distance of time before Adam alayhi salam and us? Now, of course, this is all guesswork, but just an idea. What I want to know is what kind of thoughts you may have in your head about how long ago Adam alayhi salam was. 80,000 years, and we have another one that's 300,000 years. Yeah. I mean, it's good because obviously, yeah, this is probably a little bit more accurate than some kind of literalists of the Bible who work out that it's like 5,000 years or something. 2 million. Wow. Okay. Right. Yes. Okay. Now, Allahu Alam. Of course, we don't know, right? So we're all going to accept what's clearly stated in the Quran many, many times, and it's very hard to kind of erase the reality of Adam alayhi salam, right? Adam and Hawa. What we can say, though, is that Banu Adam, the descendants, I'll just move on to this next slide, actually, for this, right? Banu Adam, the descendants of Adam alayhi salam, have definitely been around for over 50,000 years. Okay, now what happened before that? We know there were hominids. There were even what scientists nowadays call anatomically modern humans. in the sense that we don't know if they're really like us, but from their anatomy and from
ये
their
आइडिया का
bones.
वापस कैसा ले जाएंगे?
So yeah, from their bones they look human, okay, in our contemporary sense. But you know how they were in their behavior, Allahu alam. But certainly from 50,000 years ago, human beings spread all the way off to Australia. And those humans we would still call the children of Adam, right? You're not going to call an Australian Aboriginal native a non-Banu Adam. So we know that Adam and Islam must have come before the spread of humans as we know them across the whole of the earth. And that from this amazing discipline of science that's really just boomed in the past 10, 15 years called archaeogenetics has timed that kind of explosion of human beings across the world to about 50,000 plus years ago. Archaeogenetics is basically where scientists are now able to, in very sterile conditions, drill into bones and extract little bits of remnants of marrow, and from that find the DNA of very ancient bones found in, you know, various sites across the world. And then looking at the genetics of those bones compared to other bones, and also understanding the rate at which mutations occur, they are now beginning to map the journey of human beings across the world, and which bones came first and who they were descended from, etc. And that whole map. There's a brilliant book by David Reich on this. It's on YouTube as well. It's really interesting. But there we go. So 50,000. Now let's just have a look at this on this scale over here to try and understand how many years we're talking about, right? So this is 50,000. Allahu Alam. I mean, it could be a lot longer. Anatomically, modern humans, I think Ibrahim mentioned 300,000. There's some suggestions there could be even 500,000 and certainly 150,000. But we don't know if that necessarily means Adam alayhi salam. There could have been people that had like an outward form that's like us, and that when Adam alayhi salam came, they bred with these kind of hominids, and then Banu Adam came from that. Allahu Alam. It's all guesswork, isn't it, really? Okay, so here we go. 10,000, 20,000, 30, 40, 50. Now you can see that for the vast majority of this time, we were small, tiny, tiny communities living, wandering the earth, right? And not leaving any trace behind at all. Gathering from the plants around, the seeds, etc., fruit, and hunting animals and fish, and that's it. And just moving along, not carrying any significant possessions or anything like that. It's only 12,000 years ago, which is here, that the agricultural and pastoral revolutions occurred. This is when humans started to sort of say, oh, well, grass, yeah, it was almost edible. And then they started kind of like cultivating grass and then seeing that, okay, if you take the larger ones and then you take the larger ones and their seeds, and suddenly you end up with something that's turning into wheat and barley and oats and grains that are, more considerably edible. No longer requiring you to wander around all the time. You can stay and you can get a lot more food harvest from the soil, and thereby acquire food security, which was not there before, right? And the same with animals. There's all these animals wandering around. Why don't we just hold on to them? So that's the pastoral revolution. Okay, so that all occurred around about 12,000 years ago. This whole thing, this idea came to Europe about 9,000 years ago. And then about 5,000 years ago, metals come along. And after that really starts the age probably of wars and kingdoms and then empires. Okay, and that's really just about 5,000 years ago. So you can see, when the Quran says "Hinum min ad-dahri," eons of time, and it's really hard for us to even conceptualize this, that for the majority of our existence as the noble children of Adam alayhi salam, we were just living simply and wandering across the earth and not leaving a scar, not leaving any sort of sign at all. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that. And everything you see of humans has all been in just the past 12,000 years pretty much. The exception to that may be this cave painting from 30,000 years ago, and there's a few more scattered across the world in caves. But if you have a look at this one, this is in the south of France, the Chauvet Cave, and look at this amazing drawing of a lion. This is a cave lion, which has been extinct for 13,000 years. And if you look at the original painting, you can see that there's kind of a number of overlapping lions. And it's thought that when the fire flickered in that cave, it would look as if the lions are moving. That's amazing, isn't it? So the sheer genius, and what that reminds you is that even though people lived very simply, it doesn't mean that they weren't as intelligent or as sophisticated as we are today. You know, we kind of forget that. We always have this idea that people that live simply are somehow barbarians, primitives, or, you know, this kind of thing. Oh, they can barely talk, they grunt. You know, the grunting caveman kind of, you know, misunderstanding, caricature that we have. Okay, but no, you know, articulate, intelligent people, and probably people who are a lot closer to God than we are. You know how, like, when we walk around in cities, and I'm sure most of us are in cities right now, right? What you see is the artistry of man, right? All you see is great big buildings, essentially cowering above you and clouding out the magnificence of the canopy, which is God's artistry, and of nature and the mountains and the hills, all of God's artistry. We're kind of, you know, we're blinkered from that actually in our modern lives, right? Whereas, you know, these people were living in a humble way, in touch with nature. And you know, when the Quran in Surah Furqan talking about Ibadur Rahman, it says, Wa Ibadur Rahman, Allah says, Wa Ibadur Rahman, alladhina yamshawna alil ardi hawnan, that they walk on the earth humbly. Yeah. And that's just not us. You know, we are ripping through the earth at the moment, aren't we? Literally ripping the earth apart in our modern lives. And the Ibadur Rahman, not just like, yeah, you know, okay humans. These were the two devotees of Ar-Rahman, of the most gracious, were the people who walked simply on the earth. And then, you know, all of this, you know, إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب. That, you know, you know, when you look at the signs, you look at nature, it creates that little, you know, tremor of awe within us, right? And people who are close to nature would have that awe. So Sheikh Omar Farouk Abdullah, a great North American scholar, has gone through a number of very simple, you know, native tribes and looked at how they describe God, how they describe Allah. And they use beautiful names for them. Many of them have this idea of a supreme creator. Now, they might have added in mythologies around other spirits and what have you as well. But this idea of a supreme creator is there, and it transcends all, I don't know about all, but many of these very simple tribes, the hunter-gatherer type tribes. And they have beautiful names for Allah. You know, the guide, the good spirit. So these are just North American tribes, native tribes. Creator of the universe, Lord of the entire heaven and earth, ruler of the world, you to whom we pray, pure spirit, you to whom we belong. And you can see that many of these are just so similar to the 99 names that we're familiar with as well. So that was our prehistory. And, you know, it's just a little reminder, okay? Because whenever we think about ourselves as modern human beings, I think it's always important to have that lens into our past and to say, well, if we don't feel right today, maybe it's because we're ignoring the true nature of what we were designed to be, right? Abraham Maslow, you will have all heard of, I'm sure, as the author of the Hierarchy of Needs. He's thought to be he's often called the father of humanistic psychology. So this is a branch of psychology which talks about happiness, essentially. How do you address your needs in order to be happy? Yeah. And you know what, I think everyone's quite impressed with this sort of almost revelation, you might say, of this idea that, oh, hang on a sec, happiness isn't just about filling your stomach and, having your basic desires and needs taken care of, but actually beyond that, there's this idea that there is actually more to, I mean, this is a hierarchy, but there's more to human beings. There's more to our sense of being and our sense of completeness as a human than just feeding our stomachs, you might say, okay, or living as cattle live, as the Quran describes it, right? Feeding as cattle feed. But there's something much greater, and his pinnacle of achievement for the human being is this idea of self-actualization, which we'll talk about later. But just bear in mind, he tops it up with self-actualization, but this is incomplete. This is certainly incomplete. So the interesting thing is that when he was around, and interestingly, what part of what fed into his perception or his conception of the hierarchy of needs was his experience with the Blackfoot Indians. So when he was just a student, he did a sabbatical with this native tribe called the Blackfoot in Western Canada. And it, as it's described, his time with them shook him to his knees, right? Because he again had that perception that these are primitive people, and he wasn't expecting that he could learn something from them. He was probably just trying to do experiments on them or what have you. And it absolutely astounded him because he realized, and I haven't got the quotes here actually because I edited that slide out, but he realized that there is much greater character, nobility, generosity, and deep humanity in those simple native people who are basically hunter-gatherers than he saw in the neighboring village. And he described it rather rude, the kind of white settlers of the nearby town described in rather rude ways. He was quite a caustic character in his language, but articulate. It's quite funny. But he saw the contrast. That on the one hand, you've got these townspeople who are cursing the Blackfoot Indians as barbarians and primitives, etc. And when he goes and lives with them, he suddenly realizes that, oh my God, this is where true human nobility and character is. He looked at the way that they nurtured as a community, how they nurtured their young people firmly, but with immense love and immense concern for their development. And it's just, it's a real eye-opener. And so, psychology at the time was all about illness, mental illness, Freud, etc., who basically studied people who had problems. And he realized that, oh, hang on a sec, there's much more to the human psyche than looking at, mentally unwell people and trying to reach conclusions from that. And so he's famously said that perhaps human nature has been sold short because human nature was being defined by mental illness, which is completely the wrong way around. And so he made this effort to try and integrate all the different needs of the human being and define what the human nature is, what the self is essentially. Now, I'm just going to do a little segue into happiness. So psychologists nowadays define happiness, or you might say subjective well-being, as essentially like an equation. And I think this is a really useful equation for us to have ourselves. And even when we're looking at our young people as well, our children, etc., to think, okay, to what degree, in a way, if you understand the equation, you can then try to work towards happiness. So happiness is defined as this idea of a subjective well-being, right? So it's not just happiness in one moment, but that just general feeling of wellness, right, overall. And that it starts with this almost like an attitude towards your life. And that attitude towards life is called satisfaction with life. And in Arabic, we would call that qina'a, contentment, right? Um, so that's like the main bulk of this equation. But on its own, that doesn't necessarily create complete well-being. There has to also be what's happening to you as well, right? Irrespective of how philosophical you want to be about your life, if there's a lot of bad stuff happening, it's very hard to undo the emotion and the trauma of what's happening, right? So you have to add into that equation the overall balance of positive affect, which is lots and lots and lots of positive emotions put together, taking away the negative affects. And negatives can weigh more heavily. So you need a lot more positives to be able to outweigh the negative. Okay. I mean, look, that's just so much about all of this, and this is just like literally whizzing through very quickly. So the way to look at this word affect, and this is a term that, it's not like X affects B. We're not talking about so A affects B. It's not the way that we normally use it in English. Okay, affect used in sort of psychological or even psychiatric terms, as GPs use it a lot as well, is actually about the overall long-standing mood of a person. So you could compare it, and this is a really good way of sort of creating the analogy or being able to understand this, is that if you think of emotions like the elements of the weather, wind, rain, clouds, etc., and then the emotions, when you have a ton of them of one particular kind, it creates a general feeling, and that feeling then becomes a mood, right? So the emotions and the feelings are like the weather, right? And affect is the climate. It's how the weather generally is in your head, you might say. Yeah. So positive affect minus negative affect is what you're aiming for. So now the question is, okay, right, we have this idea that it's about contentment and then generally more positive emotions and less negative emotions. But what kind of things lead to that? What kind of things need to be ticked off in order to produce that sense of positive emotion and to keep away the negative emotions, right? And also, what kind of things do we need to be thinking about and have in us, within us, in order to have that sense of qina'ah, of well-being? And you could actually, so this is a little bit like, Maslow's hierarchy, but you can actually, and there's a lot more thinking now about much more than just where Maslow left off, which was self-actualization. But there's been a lot more research on other things as well, which are which are important to create a more complete sense of wellness and happiness. So Paul Wong, for instance, divides happiness into 4 sections. I mean, okay, he uses Greek terms to describe them, and that's, a little bit difficult. But basically, hedonic happiness is the happiness of, it's like pleasures that you need in order to just fulfill your basic needs, right? So that you can say is hedonic. And then prudential happiness is the happiness that you get with engaging in just human life in its more comprehensive, in its broader sense. The richness of human life. Okay, and into that you could put self-actualization, which we'll talk about later. Then there's another thing, which is eudaimonic happiness. Eudaimonia is a term that was coined by Aristotle when he was talking about how, all these people go around, this is a great quote, Ken edited that, but all these people go around searching happiness by indulging themselves. But true happiness is in living for your purpose, and your purpose was to do good, right? Which is a, profound thought. Aristotle's good at profound thoughts, particularly the Nicomachean Ethics. So this idea of making a difference, that's what we're really here for, right? And that's eudaimonic happiness. So it's a type of, it's a more elevated form of happiness, isn't it? And then there's the spiritual happiness, chaironic happiness. And this, we'll look at this further in a short while. But there's a lot of research now about these elements of happiness as well. And you might start to sense that, oh, hang on a sec. Hey, whoa, what's this? Isn't this all Islam, actually? You know, and at the point of Maslow's time, you would have thought, well, there's a lot more to a complete human being than just doing this stuff. But now, there's actually evidence for all the other good things that a human being needs to be and needs to do in order to be truly happy. So another question that maybe a fundamental question would be that, does Islam prioritize wellness in our worldly life, or is Islam really primarily about our akhirah and about success in the hereafter? Be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. What do people think, and how would you evidence that as well? Any thoughts? And we will go into this in more detail for sure.
May I just ask, what do you mean exactly by the question? Like when you say, does Islam prioritize wellness in our worldly life? Prioritize it over what?
That's a very good question, isn't it? Okay, no. So you're right. Maybe I shouldn't have maybe I shouldn't have worded it that way. But does it see it as a priority, not as in a priority above everything else, but as in something important? Priority in the sense of being important, not the ultimate priority or the only priority, but a priority. Yep, and I think Ibrahim, thank you. Your body has a right over you. I think that's a very good way of describing it. Absolutely. And actually, when we look at the teachings, there are just so many, and I won't necessarily go through them, but there's so many that are literally about. And if you think about Islamic law, and you think about the maqasid of Sharia, that there are five, or you could say six priorities, ultimate purposes, the dururiyat, the absolutely necessary things that the law, Islamic law, comes to preserve, to protect. Only one of those is deen, only one of those is faith. Everything else is about your worldly life and keeping that safe, And the Prophet ﷺ, a very famous and foundational hadith, really, where he says that there should be neither harming nor reciprocating harm. One of the five universal maxims agreed by all the madhahib is ad-dararu yuzal, that harm must be prevented, right? So this is harm in the worldly sense, right? And when we make the dua, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً, that our Lord give us in this world good and in the hereafter. So we're hoping for that from God, right? And in fact, one of the names of Allah is Al-Bar, the ultimately good, the kind, the source of good, the one who basically is the well-wisher, right? He wishes good for us in this world as well. So many things. Yuridukumul yusra wala yuridukumul usra, that he desires ease for you, not hardship. So that's in this life. So I think that's all well established. And but sometimes we have this notion, and maybe our young people have this notion, that the religion is there just to get you to paradise. But actually, no, the religion is there to teach you how to live well as well, right? And to get happiness in this world too. Now, what about a hierarchy of needs? Is there such thing as a hierarchy of needs? And what would be right at the base of such a hierarchy? Is there, would you think that there is such a notion in Islam? Now, I mean, if anybody wants to answer that, fine. If not, then I'll just carry on. It's not a problem. Physical needs, food, shelter, etc. Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. Okay, so let me show you this hadith. So, okay, so we have this idea here. You know this famous hadith where the young people looked at the Prophet Prophet's life and they realized that, how could they ever match that? And so they thought that they would need to go the extra mile. Yeah, and one decided that they'd spend the whole night in prayer, another that they would never marry, and another one that they'd spend the whole time fasting in the daytime. And the Prophet ﷺ, said that he brought them and said, "Are you the people who said this?" And he said that, by Allah, I'm more submissive of Allah, I'm more afraid of Him than you are, and yet. And yet he balances, right? And I fast and I break my fast. I sleep and I also marry women. Um, so it's this idea that these things have to be done, right? You've got to do those as well. You can't just be exclusive. Um, and then in some ways, this is even more clear. So there's a hadith in which he once made this dua, which we all know, yeah. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika minal kufri wal faqr, that I seek refuge in you from disbelief and poverty, or destitution, right? And then someone asked, are they equal? And the Prophet said, yes. So kufr and faqr are equal. They're, in other words, poverty, not even poverty, but destitution, starvation, leads to kufr. So what that's insinuating is that you have to have some degree of comfort and some degree of basic needs addressed in order to be able to think about the greater things. And it's interesting that Maslow kind of reflects on this himself, that he says that the human organism, when it is dominated by a certain need, is that the whole philosophy of the future tends to also change. For our chronically and extremely hungry man, utopia can be defined simply as a place where there is plenty of food. He tends to think that if only he is guaranteed food for the rest of his life, he will be perfectly happy and will never want anything more. And this is really interesting because, and it's true, isn't it? And we know about this, that when people are in famine and they're starving, then that's literally, that occupies their entire consciousness. So then, this idea that they'll be perfectly happy if they have food, because they can't think of happiness as being anything more than that, subhanAllah, because they're just so impoverished with the lack of one basic essential. So therefore, it's really important that these things are addressed primarily before anything greater can happen, right? And hence, the whole importance of Islamic law providing security of your possessions, of your family, and your life. All of that has to be secured before other things can happen. Any questions about that or any comments? So this is an interesting element of security, which maybe we don't immediately think of. And I feel like this is something I have to keep reminding, certainly my children as well, is that family is part of your basic needs. It's not a luxury, but it creates that immense emotional security. We don't just need the physical security of the roof over our heads or the security of food, but we also need that emotional security where we can feel we know we're loved, we know we're valued for who we are, right? And that's something that occurs in relationships that are very close, and particularly the family relationship, like the unconditional love that we all have for our children, and the kind of deep love that we should foster within the family itself. And subhanallah, you see what happens and the immense unhappiness that can be created when that's not there. Like in a society where this idea is not promoted, it's not you know, emphasized, and kids grow up not seeing the importance of that, then it causes immense trauma and insecurity of all kinds, right? And we see that. We see that. So alhamdulillah, we're really fortunate that we have a faith that puts so much emphasis on particularly the duties that one has towards one's parents, um, and then the importance of marriage and finding that life partner and having that sense of mercy and tranquility, and love and accommodation and respect with that partner, and then also the love for children as well, and the kissing, the hadith about kissing your children. So there's a person who said that, oh, I've never kissed my children. The Prophet says, he who does not show mercy to others will not be shown mercy. SubhanAllah. Um, then there's all the, so that's the importance of fostering those relations, but also the warning, which often, the Deen provides for us, of how you must not transgress that. Yeah. And look, these two hadith here are like, very important, where the Prophet ﷺ explains that, look, the person who keeps good relations with the family is not the one who's reciprocated. In other words, not the one who's always being given back good relations. Rather, the one who keeps good relations with family is the one who does so despite being cut off by them. That's tough. That's really tough, right? But it just shows the importance of this, that whoever else severs ties, it's your job to know. In our religion, no severing of ties. We have to go out and keep those ties, even when it's painful, even when it's really painful. Because there's a bigger picture here that maybe as individuals we didn't realize. There's just something much, much bigger. A person who severs ties does not enter paradise. Then there's this whole area of self-esteem. And subhanAllah, again, you wouldn't have automatically thought about it, but self-esteem is so integral to us as human beings, right? And when you think about it, fundamentally, we are these little animals scratching about on, an unfavorable planet, you might say, to some extent. And we're one amongst billions. It's very easy to feel unimportant, right? It's very easy to feel that you're unvalued and you don't matter. You just don't matter. Okay. And so that, self-esteem, or low self-esteem is a constant threat. It's always there. But not having self-esteem is so damaging in so many ways. We know about its impact on social withdrawal. So you don't, if you don't feel worthy, you don't want to mix with people because you feel like you're not going to be worthy. Being with people creates anxiety, therefore. It's related to depression because you start constantly hammering yourself down if you've got low self-esteem. Inability to reach one's potential. You see it all the time that, oh, I couldn't apply for that job because I won't get it. I'm not, there's people much better than me, people much, much better than me, that kind of thing. But also lots of interpersonal problems as well. That a person who's got low self-esteem is often defensive. If your self-esteem is rock bottom and anything challenges, teases your self-esteem, like some advice, it's seen as criticism, it's seen as an offense, and the response is defensive very often. Or the other way around, that people can then, try to boost their self-esteem by putting others down. So, not very nice. And then obviously that causes problems inside very close relationships as well. So there's a lot of science about self-esteem and the problems that it causes. But what's absolutely fascinating is that Islam puts so much emphasis on self-esteem, so much emphasis. It's one of the dururiyat in Islamic law. certainly added in soon afterwards when the idea of maqasid was developed. It's one of the absolute essentials of the purposes of the Islamic law. It called izzah, but that's dignity, which is the same as self-esteem, right? By the way, if anybody wants to just stop this at any point, ask questions or comment or critique, please do. Please do. I know it seems like a very long diatribe. So there's so much about self-esteem. I think one of the most beautiful things about Islam and self-esteem is remembering that even though you may be one amongst billions, that in front of Allah, and this is just something that's so special to Islam, that in front of Allah you are important, and Allah is the master of the universe. He is the Malikul Mulk, the master of the dominion, right? And yet, despite being so high and so important and up there, yet somehow we are still able to approach him and talk to him on a one-to-one. And when he says that, when my servant, that I answer the call of the believer when he calls upon me. Yeah. أجيب دعوة الداعي دعوة الداعي إذا دعان. And that, when my servant asks you about me, tell them I am near. SubhanAllah. And فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ, remember me, I will remember you. So many things, so many beautiful, beautiful hadith about that remind us, ayat, hadith that remind us of just how noble we are, right? And Allah said, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, that we have indeed ennobled the children of Adam, each one of us. Then there's all the things about the importance of respecting people's dignity as well. That even in us, even in our forms, we should see ourselves as dignified. Yeah. وَصَوَّرَكُمْ فَأَحْسَنَ صُوَرَكُمْ. But also the importance of being respectful to others, not seeing yourself as superior to others, and not damaging other people's self-esteem by things like slandering and backbiting. Yeah, showing respect to the elders and showing love to the young people. And then there's also this dimension which is cheering other people up, which is also about, if you make another person happy, it gives them that, the subtext of that is that you matter to them, right? So when the Prophet ﷺ said that when one of you loves his brother, let him know. Now I know that's a bit kind of weird in English culture. We don't go about saying to our friends of the same gender, we love you, but it's kind of a bit like saying I value your friendship, right? Anyway, etc. So there's so much about that. Then this whole section of growth needs, and subhanAllah, all of these are things that are innate, and you can see how, when we were those small little clusters of people living in this very challenging world and having to survive by working together as a closely knit community. That's the only way we would survive. We can't survive as individuals, right? That the individuals perished largely. You could only survive if you were closely with strong bonds, ties of kinship and friendship amongst each other, and that sense of belonging. In that environment, you can see how all of these things were actually important. Health and exercise kind of goes without saying, really. The needs, you had to be fit to survive there. But also learning and exploration. So within us, within our brains, is this whole pathway of dopamine, which is about this little buzz of excitement you get when that drives you to do something, to explore. And it was meant to drive us to explore what's over the hill and to go out looking for food, right? But nowadays it drives us to look at what's next on our TikTok and, attach us to doom scrolling. So obviously the current way that these devices here have abused our psychology is very detrimental to all of us, particularly our young people as well. And it's literally rewiring our brains, unfortunately. But in its in its true sense, it was a healthy instinct. Unfortunately, when you have too much dopamine, it downgrades the receptors. So then, normal life and the normal good things, wholesome things in life become dull because we're just overwhelmed with all the snazzing and powing and zapping and games and next scroll and big laugh and whatever. So unfortunately, it's all been messed up, but nonetheless, these things were important. And also individuality. And I think this is something we really need to recognize in our young people as well, is to value our children for their own uniqueness. They're not all going to be doctors or whatever. And they all have their, this idea essentially of multiple intelligences and that multiple gifts and talents and potentials. And, a community could not thrive if everyone was the healer or, whatever, the hunter, that everyone had to have their role within that. And that, in order for people to have their roles, they're all made slightly differently, even within the same family, so that they can diversify and create that richness and completeness within the whole of the community, right? Aesthetic as well is important. And again, we have to ask ourselves, how are we with our young people? How are they enjoying aesthetic? And again, is it being abused? Is it being overdone at times, like with music, etc.? But some aesthetic, religion isn't meant to be, life isn't meant to be drab, right? There's beauty is meant to be there, and it's meant to be enjoyed, of course, as well, right? And so there are many, many hadith about so much of this, all of this stuff. And, you'll have heard all of these hadith too. Now, where are we in time? Okay, we've got to 9 o'clock. So self-actualization. This is a very interesting part. And again, we need to think about for our young people, certainly with Islam, you'll find that, the idea of self-actualization is just inherent. It's inherent. It's very simple for us to get our heads around. So it's this idea that you have a potential, a unique potential, and that it's your duty to try to strive to achieve that potential. Yeah. And young people may not always know what their purpose in life is. I mean, heck, do I even know? But this belief almost that we're here for a reason, right? And that the meaning and the purpose of our life will reveal itself. And for some people, they might have that idea quite early on. And that, of course, that purpose might change, but nonetheless, that desire to want to achieve something and to feel like this is what I want to do is should be recognized, valued, celebrated, encouraged. Even if that doesn't become their end goal. Obviously, many people have gone through very colorful, enriching journeys where they went in one direction and then changed, etc. There's a lovely quote from Maslow in this, that he says that the role of the teacher, the therapist, the parent is as a horticulturalist whose task is to enable people to become healthy and effective in their own style. And what it meant is that we tried to make a rose into a good rose rather than to change the rose into lilies. Yeah, so they have that flower. They are all buds, but the bud is going to become a particular flower. Let it be that flower. So that's the idea of self-actualization. Part of that, obviously, and we've talked about this already, is this idea of finding personal purpose. And that's very closely linked to this feeling of meaning in life, that life must have meaning. And it's very hard to do that if you're an atheist. It's almost like your meaning in life is not entirely rationalized, right? It's hard to rationalize it properly, but much easier if you have faith. Because, the idea of meaning in life is that whatever happens to you is there for a purpose, and it's leading in a particular direction, right? It's all going to, your life matters, and everything that happens is all important within that journey that your life is going to be on. And Viktor Frankl very famously said this, I mean, many of you will know about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, his experience in the concentration camps, etc., and his drive to get through it by picturing a future where he was like guiding the next generation, etc. So yeah, he says that in some ways suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment that it finds meaning, right? So it's this, whatever happens, if it's there for a purpose, even if you don't immediately know the purpose, but you know that there will be a purpose for it, then it doesn't become suffering anymore. It becomes part of the journey. Um, yeah. I mean, Wong puts this beautifully. He says that since we only go through this life once, I mean, obviously, well, I guess it's true for all of us that we go through this hayat dunya once, right? We have reasons to wonder how to make the most of it. The worst fear is not death, but the discovery that we have never really lived when the time comes for us to die. SubhanAllah. We dread the meaningless life as much as we dread the terror of death. Interesting. So anyway, I'll move on. And you know, from here we have every one of you is a guardian and will be questioned about his responsibilities, essentially, right? And the verse in the Quran that you are the best of peoples evolved for the benefit of mankind. That there's a purpose for all of us as a community, right? So part of this is interestingly striving, which is jihad essentially, right? And grit. Grit is like himma, you might translate in Arabic, which is that perseverance despite the setbacks. Yeah. And then hope, which kind of keeps you going beyond all of that. All of these are integral to achieving self-actualization. You can't, without all of that, self-actualization is just a dream, isn't it? Yeah, you've got to have those elements. And there's lots of evidence also. And there's great books on positive psychology that have the evidences in them and the studies, etc. That these are all important elements. And you might think, well, grit is like, what, tough, suffering. But of course, you have to have that in order to achieve anything. We've all done that through exams, etc., or whether it's in sports, etc., as well. So that's all well and good. In some ways, the outcome, you might say, of self-actualization, or in some instances, the outcome is flow or mastery. Just out of interest, how many people have heard of flow in the psychological sense? Hands up. No? No? Okay. So flow it's a concept, but it's actually a physiological state. So flow is where you gain mastery in something, right, as a human. You're really good at something. And then when you do that thing that you're really good at, then the brain actually, studies of, was it PET scans originally, but nowadays it would be fMRIs, actually show that there's less brain activity when you're in a flow state because the brain doesn't have to concentrate hard. Concentrate hard is very energy consuming, and the brain can almost relax when you're in a flow state. So how do you get into a flow state? Well, flow state, it's not easy. It's about mastering something. And then when you're doing it, so if it's sport, or in your professional life, it might be something specifically that you do. I mean, like I do musculoskeletal injections, and maybe when I'm examining a shoulder and then I'm putting it right and manipulating and all that, then I'm kind of in a flow state. I don't even have to think too hard. It all just, there's muscle memory and the hands just go in the right places and press in the right places, and it's just all happening. I don't, I could be having a conversation doing other things because it's not like I need to concentrate on this. But I think for our kids, when we think about how do we engender flow in our children, how do we help them to gain mastery in something? You don't have to wait till you're like 45 or 50, but like sports, and I wouldn't recommend computer games. They're toxic, really. But certainly things like sport or an instrument or something that it takes a lot of effort. It'll take some of their young years to do this. but when they get good at something, then there's just a certain level of calm that's called a flow state that is acquired. And then, of course, when times are tough, you can, if you get into the flow state, it provides a lot more of that positive affect that we were talking about, that balance of happiness. Now, just moving on very quickly to we've done. Oh yeah, there's, and we know when it comes to this sort of thing, we know there's so much in the Quran about finding personal purpose, and then also about sort of grit and striving, juhud. And yeah, and the flow is like the proficiency, getting good at something and doing it really well, right? But then now there's this whole branch of psychology called positive psychology, which is all about the benefits psychologically for caring, kindness, what's called pro-social behavior. And there are just so many studies about this, which is, almost bizarre, because like in our rather elementary sense of what might be happiness, we would think that it's self-indulgence. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that happiness comes from looking after other people, from caring, right? From having a conscience and living by it, essentially. Yeah, because that drives you to pro-social behavior. And so many studies about it. And it makes sense, right? That if for all these years we were designed to live for 35,000 years plus, we were designed to live in these small communities where happiness was the community, was the success of the community, then caring for the community, doing everything for the community was actually what brought our own personal happiness as well. Yeah, you couldn't survive without that thriving of the community as well. Yeah. So it's absolutely fascinating that all of this has come along. There's a lot of material and evidence for all of these things leading to happiness. So yeah, and then yeah, in education, in the educational sphere as well, but also in the work sphere as well, having all of this. But we see that professionally, right? So people aren't very nice professionally, they're just generally unhappy as well, and of course in Islam it's very clear that character is important. The Quran, innaka la'ala khuluqin azim, that indeed you, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is set upon an exalted character, and then we just need to look at his life and everything that he has done, and you see that exemplification, right? So that's all the thing, and this is really fascinating that there's a huge area of psychology now about positive psychology. It's called about caring, and in some ways, we should be asking as parents as well that in what way are we nurturing that element of our nafs, of our self, of our fitra, of our good nature. And are we growing our young people to practice caring for others? Then we get this idea of self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is very interesting because it's about, so we've talked about the individual self, then we've talked about caring for other people. Self-transcendence is this idea of being able to just get out of your body altogether, right? And not think about yourself at all. And this is a type of happiness. Self-transcendence is a type of happiness. And for us, it's very simple. All we need to do is think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you realize that actually you are nothing and there's something much greater. And then especially when you realize that, he cares for you as well. It's easy to do that self-transcendence. It's much harder if you're an atheist. You can still self-transcend by having a cause, like many communists would have had the cause of fighting for the state, or for the and some people fighting for the oppressed, like many people who are not Muslim or not even believing in God are very agitated by what's happening in Palestine and in supporting them, right? So you can have these causes of justice, and in that way you're transcending, where you're saying that myself is not important. And of course, the more you get out of yourself, the more your internal woes and worries seem to pale into insignificance. So you can see how there is all this evidence on the importance of self-transcendence. What's really important, really interesting though, is how often do you see in school the idea of self-transcendence being taught? The importance of self-transcendence, not just the idea, but the importance of it. It's not there, is it? It's really not there in the curriculum. I mean, okay, religions are taught as in like curiosities, right? These are the curious things that Jews do. These are the curious things that Hindus do or Muslims do. But the importance, the evidence, and the crucial nature of self-transcendence, because that's an important part of happiness. It's not there, interestingly, right? Or tragically, should I say. Right, so that's self-transcendence. Interestingly enough, you know, when Maslow stopped at self-actualization, towards the end of his life, he started to realize that, oh, hang on a sec, there are two types of self-actualizers. There's actually people who self-actualize for themselves, like become the ultimate sportsman so they can be like, you know, recognized as such. Then there's other people who self-actualize when they feel like their self isn't important. And these are what he called the transcenders. I mean, he never integrated this into his model. I guess he died too soon for that. But you know, that's what other people have taken on beyond that. Of course, transcendence is important, more important than all of this, right? So people who transcend the ego, essentially. And there are two types of transcendence. There's the peak experiences. This is where, you know, you're living your life and you're just living a regular life, and then suddenly something happens and then you're out of your body. Like there's certain drugs, what are they called again? Like LSD, psychedelic drugs that can just get you out, and then it just like puts you in like, whoa, completely different world, and you come back and you feel like you're floating above your life still. So I'm not recommending psychedelics, but there's evidence that it just kind of changes the way that people think or about their lives afterwards. But for us, this idea of the peak experience occurs in like sajda, right? Where your head is down, you recognize your lowliness, and you're thinking about the highest, Subhana Rabbil A'la, and your mind can just go out to connect with the highest in that lowly state that you're in. SubhanAllah, that's literally transcending. You've earthed yourself, you've lowered yourself, and then you connect to Allah, the highest, the master of the dominion, and then you can ask and everything. So SubhanAllah, that's you know, that's like a high. That's a high that we can get. And all we need to do is get ourselves into the mind for that. But with transcendence, there's also this idea of uh, a sort of not a healthy transcendence, not just the highs, but actually in our whole lives integrating this idea of that there's something much greater, you know, and the healthy transcendence. You know, how can we integrate transcendent experiences into the ongoing stream of everyday life? And, you know, Islam just gives you such an easy answer to that. You know, that's dhikr all the time, dhikr, and also finding, I'll skip all of this, and finding that kind of relevance, the spiritual. This is another point that Maslow made actually, is that you find the spiritual in your secular life. You know, it's almost like you're seeing this, bit like the Matrix, isn't it? You're seeing this as just a play in a way. It's just a facade, and you see the spiritual dimensions beyond it and through it. And you see human beings not as animals but as souls, as arwah, as ruh, right? And that have this eternal trajectory, and that you value them for that, irrespective of their outward form, etc. You see, that's the beauty of being a self-transcender, inshallah, if we want to use that language. Now, I personally would put self-acceptance, which is another big thing, and this is what we'll finish on. And what we're doing time-wise. Oh gosh, yes, I really need to stop now. So self-transcendence, self-acceptance, I think in some ways, if we're talking about our human needs in our life, right, then in some ways you could argue that the ultimate achievement, no, the ultimate need is to self-accept, which is getting to this stage. But you could argue that this is somewhere else. Allahu alam. I mean, I think from an Islamic point of view, we know that the basic needs are important, and then the others you can put them wherever you like. But I just feel like somehow self-acceptance could be at the top of this, because it's about coming to terms with everything about our nature as human beings. Right, we're not perfect. We're not perfect in our character, in our maybe our outward forms, and then we have ups and downs in life as well. Right, we know that whenever there's a good time, there's going to be a bad time. But we also believe that when there's a bad time, there'll be a good time as well. So we continue to live in hope as well, right? And we also know that at the end of it all, it's all going to come to an end, and then we move on. So these, this coming to end, as Wong was describing that, for an atheist, the biggest thing is the end of life, and then what was it for? Was there a meaning to it, and all that kind of thing. So for us, that the whole state of being able to come to terms with the, whatever we're given, so we believe, for instance, that a rizq is not just the money and the wealth that we're given, or the house or whatever, but it's also the relationships, and it's also the innate skills that we have, and it's all the opportunities that we have. They're all part of our rizq, right? So they're all written for us and they all come to us. And everything that happens, whether it's good or bad, is for a reason. And that ultimately Allah wishes well for us. So all of these things help to feed into this sense of self-acceptance, which without faith is so difficult, right? It's like the existential crisis that everyone is, to some degree sleepwalking through, and every so often they wake up and really feel it. And in many ways with Iman, we're saved from that to some extent. Aspects of that are the savoring the now. So if you have this feeling of self-acceptance, you realize that, okay, good times are here now today, but they will go. But that's fine. It's all right. That's life. Okay. What it means though is that you savor the present. Whenever there is good, you feel gratitude for it. You make yourself present in that moment. You really savor everything about that moment. And here, things like mindfulness come in as well, where you literally can shut off everything else and just really feel and connect very strongly with maybe you're outside and you're out in nature, and you just really just savor the smells and the sights, and the lack of sound or the chirping of the birds or whatever, and just say Alhamdulillah and show gratitude for that moment, and just say, because at the end of the day, it's as that first verse about Adam and Eve said, right? That there will be enjoyment, there will be pleasures, and all of those are there. They keep us going through life, right? And there's happiness and there's hope. We have children, or we have nephews and nieces and their futures to look forward to and to celebrate. So these are all things that, they will come with their challenges as well, but they're moments that we can just celebrate and know that all of this goodness is all from the rizq that we're given. It's all coming from Allah, and we should just be thankful for it. Knowing and not feeling bad if it doesn't carry on, So anyway, this was a journey through this kind of matrix, you might say, of what constitutes happiness from a psychological point of view, but as we can see, also from a religious point of view, and in fact, yeah. So this is just to remind us that all of this, when you look at it through the lens of prehistoric man, it all makes sense. That all of this helps the prehistoric man to thrive, right? And in our artificial environments, we have to say, okay, how can we bring ourselves back to all those beautiful, wholesome things that make us a complete human being? And it's interesting how, religions kind of take you more into the meaning orientation, whereas a lot of people are falling downwards towards the kind of, you could say happiness or the pleasure orientation in life at the moment. And there's just a lot of stuff about the value of religion in psychology. So I've looked quite a bit into DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy, which is very useful for helping people with anxiety and things like that. And there's a lot of recognition of the importance of things like prayer and just religion itself, where where it is done not just a label, but it's actually with conviction, and particularly where the religion helps you to integrate what's going on in your life into a framework that gives it meaning, which of course Islam does, inshallah. That's I think that's really where I wanted to go with this. Oh, these are some of the books that I mentioned, really, articles that are really interesting, definitely worth the read.